Welcome to Analytics Nexus. Thanks for joining us for Matthew Coen's presentation, focusing on the KPIs that matter. Matt has been focused on user interface design and optimization since the late 1990s, when he was responsible for the user interface of GE's application integrator. Following GE, Matt worked for startup companies Foresee Results, now Foresee, and Omniture, prior to managing marketing analytics for Nissan North America. After Nissan, Matt was Director of Analytics and Optimization for Resource Interactive, now IBM iX, until being recruited by Deloitte. Matt has been with Deloitte for 8 years and is responsible for analytics and optimization on Deloitte.com globally.
You've probably heard the term KPIs thousands of times, but how often are those KPIs really good? And are they what you're using to drive everything that's happening behind that initiative? Oftentimes the answer to those questions are no. But KPIs really are the foundation of any given project from my perspective. There are lots of performance indicators, lots of metrics that I'm sure you're capturing, but not all of them are key. Key performance indicators actually define what a strategy or tactic should do. And if you set them up in advance, they dramatically increase your likelihood of success, because the KPIs actually guide the execution of everything you're doing. They inform what the creative should do. They inform how the user experience should be designed. They inform how the developers should code, because when you have those KPIs set up in advance and you've communicated them adequately, everyone will know what they're supposed to be delivering. And that's ultimately why key performance indicators are so critical to everything that you do. Now, when we look at the digital marketing lifecycle, business objectives should always be the center of your universe, and they're going to have their own set of KPIs. Those things are usually high-level metrics like gross profit or market share. Could be any number of different things. But again, those business objectives will have their own KPIs. From business objectives, you're going to develop strategies, and those strategies should also have their own set of KPIs, as well as the tactics that you're using to inform the strategies. Now, reporting is critical. Reporting, of course, should always be automated when possible, but it also should focus back on the KPIs for those things that you are, for those tactics and strategies that you're taking and employing. It's often the case that reporting has lots of different numbers on them, or reports have lots of different numbers. Let's go back. In the digital marketing lifecycle, business objectives should be the center of your universe. And business objectives will have their own set of KPIs, things like gross revenue, things like market share. From those business objectives, you'll create strategies that will help to ultimately achieve the business objectives, and those strategies will have their own set of KPIs, as will the tactics that you deploy as part of your strategy. And those tactics will each have their own set of KPIs. So you're going to have a lot of KPIs, but they all need to be in alignment. And it's also critical that when you look at reporting, that your reporting is primarily focused on your KPIs. Oftentimes, people will have reporting that has many, many numbers on it, but very few of them are really focused on what matters. And when your reporting focuses on what matters, and focuses on those KPIs, then your analysis will follow suit, because when your reporting is showing an opportunity to improve or some place where you're failing, your analysis can then zoom in on those and help you come up with ideas that you then test, all designed to improve the performance of those KPIs. Again, if you don't have those KPIs clearly defined, then all of this breaks down, and it gives you the opportunity to head down roads that ultimately don't lead to your objectives. Alignment is critical. Your tactical objectives have to be in line with your strategic objectives, which have to ultimately lead up to the top of the pyramid, which is your business objectives. And so it's important that as you're setting objectives, that you're not doing them in a vacuum. It's important that you're always looking down or up, as the case may be, toward what those particular tactics are supposed to be driving, how they relate to your strategies, and how your strategies can ultimately drive your business objectives. Now, great KPIs have a couple of things in common. They're actionable. When you're looking at your KPIs and they're not performing as you had hoped or expected, you can do something about it. In order to know that, they have to be measurable. And of course, again, they all have to be related back to your objectives. There are a lot of pitfalls that you can encounter on your journey. One of the common mistakes or pitfalls that people deal with is not having clearly defined the KPIs up front, and as a result, not having them align with the business goals. One of the common occurrences is in campaigns that are designed for things like branding or awareness. It's very common that at the beginning of a campaign, when it's being developed, everyone's talking about how we're going to affect the brand or how we're going to make people aware of a new product. But at the end of that campaign, a leader comes back and says, how many sales did we generate from it? Well, of course, if you have a branding campaign or awareness campaign, they're typically not focused on driving sales. They don't have, in many cases, strong KPIs. We're not talking about sales and those kind of things. So the performance from a sales perspective is often underwhelming, even though the branding or awareness campaign may have done its job very effectively. So having, again, that alignment up front is critical. Another problem that people run into often is having too many KPIs. You can't manage effectively to 20 things. When you're developing your KPIs for any given activity, try to limit it to 3. If you have to go as high as 5, but after that, draw the line. If you have 10 things that are important, that's fine, but you need to prioritize those and only try to focus on delivering 3 to 5 maximum. That's going to allow you to make decisions that will optimize the performance of those things, because again, it's very difficult to optimize the performance of 20 different things. The other problem that I alluded to is that the wrong people are often setting the KPIs. Because KPIs are usually metrics based, a lot of times analysts will be determining what the KPIs are. And those KPIs aren't necessarily in alignment with what your business leaders are expecting, and sometimes aren't even metrics that those people will understand. So it's absolutely critical that you set leader expectations and understanding of what your KPIs for any given project are. You get their buy-in, and that you continually socialize those KPIs. Because if you don't continually socialize those KPIs, people will, number one, not understand them or know what they are. And oftentimes, even if they did know it at the beginning of the project, by the time they're in the middle or the end of the project, they've forgotten. And if that happens, then the opportunity for things to go sideways occurs. So we want to make sure that we're always doing a great job of communicating what KPIs are up and down the food chain. Okay, so we've talked about some things to avoid, but how do we start to a definition of KPIs well? We start with making sure that you've got the right audience. And then understanding that audience and where they come from. You need to have a very different conversation with a business leader than you do with somebody who is a hardcore marketer. If the person's an analyst, they're going to understand all the nitty-gritty detail of the metrics, but they may not necessarily understand the big picture from the business perspective. So again, really important that you understand what the project is supposed to do, but also making sure that you understand as you're having these KPI discussions, you understand who your audience is and you're asking them the right kinds of questions. So things to absolutely avoid are some of the common and simple questions we ask, which is, what are your KPIs? Well, again, most of the time, unless you're talking to an analyst, the marketer or the business leader may not be aware of all of those different metrics that might inform how you're meeting the business objectives. And so it's really important that you ask questions in a way that that person can understand without having to rely on the couple of metrics that they perhaps are familiar with or have heard of before. It's the same reason we avoid questions like, what metrics do you want to capture, or what are you doing now? Because again, that sort of assumes that what they've done in the past is good, and oftentimes it's not. Many times if you ask somebody, what metric are you or would you like to capture, they're simply going to tell you the things that they're aware of, and it's not necessarily going to be in alignment. So as we start to think about that problem, we have to come up with some solutions to set the stage correctly. And one of the things that I've been able to do effectively is use an approach where I would come in with a slide or a presentation that I could hand them that would have a few different fact or elements of a campaign or an initiative, and ask people, what's most important to you? So I might ask them, in a digital experience, what's the most important thing? And then I would go through the group of decision makers and get their input. Many of them will say business results. Some of them might say meeting our customers' needs and objectives. Some of them might think that design is what it's all about. And you let them work through that and talk through that. Now, there's no right or wrong answer per se, but the next step is critical. And without asking them to share this, as a matter of fact, they tell them, I don't want you to answer this question, but I do want you to answer this to yourself. What reporting do you get? What KPIs have you been setting for initiatives like this? And how well do those things align with what you just told me was most important? The majority of time when you do that, you can start to see the light bulb go off in people's eyes. They realize that they're getting a lot of reporting. They may be even managing to certain metrics or KPIs that they currently have, but those things aren't necessarily in alignment with what the objectives are and what they say is most important. So this is a great way to prime the pump. Once you've done that, then focus on these two questions. Now, these are questions that I've been using for much of my career, and a former colleague, Tim Wilson, dubbed them the two magic questions. That's because they're simple and virtually anyone can understand them. Again, really simple questions. What is this supposed to do? Ultimately, that is your business objective, but you're asking people to explain that in a way that they can easily understand and then explain to you in their own language. So again, what's it supposed to do? And then the KPI question or the metrics question is, how will we know if it did that? So again, they're telling you what it's supposed to do, and then what is it that we're going to be able to measure and look at that will help us understand that we've actually met that business objective. Now, through the course of that conversation, you may have to paraphrase these two questions 2 or 3 times to get to a solid answer. But by walking through this and allowing folks to use language that they understand, we can then help them choose the right metrics to align with those business objectives and the outcomes that we're expecting. Now, once we decided what those right KPIs are, we're not done. It's absolutely critical that we set targets. So we know that we want to improve file downloads, or we know that we want to drive sales, or we know that we want to improve our brand perception. And we figured out how we're going to measure those things. At that point, we need to determine how much change or how much success do we expect from this particular initiative. Now, sometimes we have things like historic data and benchmarks that we can draw on and say, here's what we've done, and we want to improve upon those. But sometimes it's something completely brand new, and no one has a real good idea of what kind of performance you can expect. There's a couple of strategies that you can take to deal with that. The first is what we'll just call back of the napkin computing. So we'll sit down, take a look at some things that are similar that we've done, take a look at our current conversion rates and other things we're doing. And we can start to get an idea, in many cases, of what performance will look like. Once we've done that, then we can set some fairly realistic targets in terms of what we will expect from this new initiative. Now, if that doesn't work, then this idea of bracketing is the next tactic to try. And in doing so, you'd say, well, we've decided that, again, for example, we want to drive file downloads. If we execute this change or this campaign and no one downloads anything, is that acceptable? Of course, the answer to that will be no. Then we would say, well, can we expect to get 10 million downloads? To which the user says, well, that's that section of the site only gets 1 million visitors a month, so no, we're not going to get 10 million. Okay, now we have some range to work with. So we know the number is somewhere between 0 and 1 million, and we whittle our way down to find an acceptable range to start with. Now, we may not want to share those targets with the rest of the world, or we may want to share them with some caveats that this has never been done before, but ultimately we always want to start with some kind of objective so that we have the ability to gauge our performance. Also, the more that you do this, the more that you set those clear targets, the better you'll get at setting targets, and the more you'll understand your performance and how to drive particular aspects of your performance. Once you've determined what those targets are, it's clear that you, or it's really important rather that you document them clearly. So we're going to increase conversion by 10%, or we're going to get 500,000 visits from this campaign. We're going to drive $1 million in sales. Now, one of the clear objectives should always be that the boss is happy. But again, this comes back to that idea of making sure that you've socialized your KPIs and your targets. Because the boss might be happy at the beginning of the project, but particularly if it's a campaign that lasts a long period of time, and you don't continually remind people of what your KPIs and targets are, the tendency is for people to forget, and sometimes for those objectives to even shift. So the boss can be happy at the beginning of the project knowing that you're on the path to success, but if you don't continually communicate what we're trying to achieve and how we're going to measure that success, then again, often that will morph. So again, make sure that you document the objectives, make sure you document the KPIs, make sure you document the targets. And then my preferred method of reminding people is quite honestly at the beginning of every single meeting where these things are discussed, we remind them of what those KPIs and targets are. So the idea here is, again, don't ever let anybody forget midstream what you started out to do. Once you've done that, and you started to accumulate results, you have the opportunity to really start to dive in and understand not only how things have performed, but how you improve them. And this allows you to continually set better KPIs and better targets for all of your objectives. The process that I've used historically is fairly simple. You understand what your average performance is, and you understand what the range of performance is for like activities. So let's talk about this from the perspective of marketing or advertising campaigns, because that's fairly easy to understand, and many organizations have hundreds if not thousands of different campaigns going on over the course of a year. We would begin to separate those different campaigns by their objective. So we want to compare branding campaigns with branding campaigns. We want to compare sales campaigns against sales campaigns, and so on. Once you've done that, we start to look at what's the average performance, and then what is the range of performance. Now, once we've done that, I typically ignore everything that's average. Again, if you've got hundreds or thousands of campaigns that you're running, most of the time you don't have the bandwidth to dig into all of them. And again, if they're performing sort of on an average scale, it doesn't make much sense to look at them, because again, they're average. Focus on those outliers. Take a look at those campaigns that did really, really well. Take a look at those campaigns that failed. And ideally, you are failing some of the time. Now, not all the time, obviously, but if you're not failing at least a portion of the time, you're probably not pushing the envelope. And you probably have a much lower chance or lesser chance of doing anything that's going to perform really well. I mean, you want to figure out what works, and you want to keep using those things. But again, if you're trying to up that performance level, you've got to push a little bit. So again, by focusing on the outliers and what was different about this campaign that did really well, and what was different about this campaign that was really bad, ultimately you can start to use those learnings on all of your campaigns, and ideally start to decrease the standard deviation or the range of performance. So you're going to make everything perform much more similarly, at the same time as increasing the overall average of your performance. So everything is getting better and everything is getting more consistent, with, again, those possible exceptions of where you're trying something that maybe is a little bit radical or different, just to see if it works. If you use these ideas and you really focus on the right KPIs up front, setting those targets, using the two magic questions to make sure that you have KPIs that everyone can buy into and everyone can clearly understand. Socialize these throughout the organization, and do that early so everyone understands their role in success. Document what works and what doesn't. All of those things combined will give you a much greater chance of succeeding in everything that you do moving forward. Now, all of this stuff is fairly simple, but it's not necessarily easy, which is why, despite the fact that I've been doing this for more years than I care to admit, I continually come back to the importance of defining and reporting against great KPIs as the foundation of virtually everything we do. With that, I wish you great success in the future, and hope that you develop and report against great KPIs in everything you do.
Thanks so much for watching this presentation. Join us on the Analytics Nexus Slack to talk with our presenters about this topic and more.